Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to the channel. And today I want to talk about artificial intelligence and Christian organizations and their use of it. And we're specifically going to talk about Answers in Genesis, but I do want to talk about kind of the broader topic of Christian organizations or churches using artificial intelligence to provide feedback and answers, and well, even further than that, writing articles and just developing their materials through the use of AI. Now, I've been talking about this for about a year. I've made several prayer videos about Answers in Genesis, in which I predicted that one of the things they would do is they would feel the need to produce their own chat GPT basically for Christians, right? To answer questions from a Christian perspective and to exclude other answers, right? To provide a particular worldview to their particular answers. In other words, to train a model on a particular database of information that would then provide answers to a particular audience, the audience of Answers in Genesis. But I also want to talk about this as a new method that many, I think, churches and large other Christian denominations and organizations will utilize as well. But let's talk about Answers in Genesis first. I'm going to show you my first interaction with its new chatbot called AI Genesis. And then I also want to show you what's behind it. Like, what is it? How is it developed? And that will lead me to be able to have a short conversation about how AI is being integrated into the church. So this is something that Ken Ham just announced today at Answers in Genesis, one of the, I'll say, the premier young earth creation ministries in the world. And Ken Ham has been talking about this for a little while. And I had said, as I said before, I had even predicted that he would do this. We've been talking about doing this project for some time, and I'm excited to finally announce a brand new tool that will help find answers to your questions, AI Genesis. This chat tool, an extension of our website, has been under development and testing for months, and we've now rolled out a beta test version for anyone who has an account on the website. And you can see down here, I've got this little box that says, curious about the Bible? Let's chat. And if I click on that, I'm going to come up with, oh, there's all the chats I've already done. I'm gonna actually read you some of the chats that I've done to show you the type of responses that it gives. And I know the Answers in Genesis site very, very well. And so I provided a couple questions that I knew what the answers were to based on my reading of Answers in Genesis information. And I wanted to see how accurate these responses are. How much do they reflect the mood and the attitude of those that Answers in Genesis? But before I get to this, I think it's more important to back up and look at the bigger picture of what's behind this particular chatbot. How was it developed? And what does it mean that it's providing answers from Genesis, right? Literally answers from not just Genesis, but answers from Answers in Genesis. Okay. How is it trained to do that? How do these chatbots work? No, we're not going to, this isn't like a total techie talk or anything like that, but I'm going to give you a basic overview of like some of the, like how an organization like Answers in Genesis might go about training this particular large language module to provide the answers that it does. And to do that, I need you to take you to the organization that is providing this chatbot. All right, they didn't just create this themselves. They're using another service which is helping them produce this AI Genesis chat GPT version that provides answers in the context of a young earth creationist worldview. You see, Ken Ham's big concern is that if you go to ChatGPT or Claude or Gemini or Minstrel or any one of or DeepSeek now or something like that, which is a Chinese search engine, and you ask questions about the origin of the earth, right? About biological diversity, about human origins, about any of those types of questions. And what you're going to get, of course, are responses that are the conventional sort of evolutionary biology, old age of the earth sort of responses, conventional geology, astronomy. Specifically ask about young earth creationist issues, right? Or ask it to provide young earth evidences. It will provide evidences that young earth creationists have suggested, because of course these large language modules have been trained on vast amounts of internet data, of which Answers in Genesis and some of these other young earth creationist organizations have a large amount of publicly available data. And therefore they're able to spit back, right, responses that are like the average or sum total of what young earth creationists would say. But then it almost always provides, those services almost always provide caveats about how, this is what young earth creationists say, and then it might actually give some contrary data. Like it might give some alternative information that you might want to consider, right? Because most of its data set, most of its brain, all right, has been fed a vast amount of information for which is not young earth creationist, doesn't have a young earth creationist perspective. And therefore it is going to present the average view of the internet, all right, the internet's knowledge to that. Now that's oversimplifying, all right, because it's not always just the average, it's how it's been trained. Right? People have looked at the responses and said, like, no, that's not an appropriate response. Here would be a better response. So the people who actually are training, doing the post-training stuff that's done after a large language module has been feeding on a vast amount of data, how they have set the how they've set the parameters for the types of responses it should give for particular important questions, right, makes a big difference, right, in terms of what is being, what you're getting as a response as the public. So Ken Ham, of course, I understand he's not happy, right, with the typical responses given. They're not the response that he would provide. So this is the wave of the future, and in the sense of the fragmenting internet. And that is, we silo ourselves into like, these are my convictions. These are the websites I go to get information, which, confirms the things that I already believe. And now these sites will be training modules based on their particular worldview, and therefore will provide answers within that particular worldview context. Rather than having to go to the individual articles. And I'm going to show you a couple examples where I'm going to ask some questions, which normally I would have to do the search box, which is basically, it's not necessarily Google, but it's something very similar to Google that's searching their entire site and then giving a bunch of links. Then I would have to go to those articles, read those articles in order to find the information I wanted. The idea with a chatbot is that it has all the information from the entire website in its mind, in its database. And then when you ask a question, it's going to pull from all of that to provide the most likely answer based on the words you strung together in your question, because large language modules aren't actually truly thinking about what you're saying, right? Or understanding. They're simply looking at the word order and the association of those words with things in its database. Oh yeah. So I got a little off track. I wanted to go and show you, before I do this little activity, I wanted to take you to the organization that is providing behind the scenes the chatbot information and has probably done the training for this particular AI Genesis. So BibleChat.ai is the organization or company that is providing the service for Answers in Genesis. And they are providing a very similar service for a number of other people, right? So they've listed a number of different churches and organizations for which they are also providing the same kind of service. They are providing something called Bible Chat, or the Faith Assistant, right? Your personal faith assistant. You have questions about Scripture. You have questions about how to integrate things. right? So this is basically a sales pitch for why you should use their company. And down here we have, you know, they've already, as a company, developed all these knowledge databases on all these different questions, you know, theological, moral, ethical, societal, answers from a Christian perspective. Now, here's the thing. This is a broad-based, a big umbrella Christian organization. So we'll say mostly Protestant in nature. And so their answers are going to be answers that you're not really sure, like what exact theological tradition do some of the answers come from, right? AI for the church, trusted large language modules for Christian software. They're going to train and deploy large language models associated or aligned with your organization's biblical doctrine. So now their general faith assistant is trained on like mounds of historical Christian writings from a variety of different perspectives, along with lots and lots of other church documents, theological, journals and so forth. But you're going to get kind of like a broad perspective through that. But then if you are a particular denomination, right, with particular doctrinal viewpoints, right, you can have, they will assist you in training a large language module. Actually, they're not training the large language. They're deploying a large language module, which they then train with their own data, right, have additional training with their own specialized data set. And that data set will be your documents from your organization. So for Answers in Genesis, it was like here you go. Here's access to, like, here's all our videos. Here's all our blog posts, and here's all the articles that are written and so forth. All this stuff, right? We give it to you. It then consumes all that information, right? And then says, look, you can only answer, like it trains the module to say, like, you can only provide answers from the perspective provided by these documents, right? And then point people only to answers that are provided in these particular documents. So they use an existing model, right? Now, foundational models are things like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, Meta has one, like the Llama, and Minstrel, which turns out Minstrel is the one that Answers in Genesis is using. That's an open source large language module. And so they have more access to being able to tweak it to do what they want it to do. That's part of the reason for using that. There's also a price consideration too. All these models if you're doing large amounts of prompting, there's a price associated with the number of tokens, which is the number of little bits of information that come out of these. So I went to the Faith Assistant, which is part of Chat, Bible Chat. All right, one of the services this company provides. So meet the Faith Assistant, artificial intelligence designed to help churches and Christian organizations engage their community and provide guidance based on biblical teachings. I mean, chatbots have existed for a long time. There's nothing more than a fancy search vehicle, except that it's going to write a response to your question that synthesizes from all the information that's been provided, right? So it is, in a way, searching everything, but it's not just searching for a line to give you. It's like, hey, this is my body of knowledge. I've put all these pieces together, and I'm going to integrate that information into a response, into an answer. So I asked it a couple questions. I asked the Faith Assistant something, probably not something most people are asking the Faith Assistant, right? I didn't ask any Bible questions. I was interested to see what it would say about itself. So I asked, what LLM foundational module do you use to train this Faith Assistant? Would it tell me? I actually didn't think it would tell me. But it came back with this. Faith Assistant utilizes a combination of advanced AI models with various functions. Some aspects rely on open AI models, such as ChatGPT-4 and GPT 3.5. Those are actually older models rather than the newest ones. Part of the reason for that might be cost. There's definitely a different cost structure for the different large language modules. And if you're an organization that's going to rely on maybe hundreds of thousands of uses, then we're talking about a significant cost difference. And so they're actually using models that are a little bit older. Additionally, for certain functions, we employ an open source model developed by AI for the church. Okay, so they're actually using another organization's product called AI for the church, something that's must be trained or tweaked, or maybe the interface is made so that they can use that to then train through that particular company's interface with AI. And that is based on Minstrel. Minstrel is a French company, and it's an open source AI foundational model. It's very much equivalent to something like ChatGPT. I've used Minstrel before. It's I would say the responses are on par with, say, ChatGPT 4. This hybrid approach allows Faith Assistant to effectively handle a wide range of queries and tasks. Right. So they're using Minstrel, this French company, to provide the basic, core, the original foundation of like how the AI functions. And then now you give it like commands on top of that, right? You're giving it like here's a special database, right? And then you're telling it like, people are going to query you, but the questions they ask you need to find the answers within this particular database. I'm not exactly sure what happens if you ask like, what's 2 + 2? And it's like, well, that's not something that Answers in Genesis really ever talked about. So how do you answer a question for which they've never talked about? Actually, maybe we should try that. When I go back to the chat box, we'll ask some questions that Answers in Genesis would have, nothing to do with. So are they saying, is there some way in which it will then, use its, foundational knowledge in order to answer those questions? Do you provide Catholic? I was wondering, like, where is it getting its information from? What kind of answers is it providing? Do you provide Catholic context as well? Or do your responses focus solely on Protestant perspectives? It said, no, Faith Assistant aims to provide responses based on the Bible, which is the central text for Catholic and Protestant traditions. Yeah, there's one tricky thing about saying from the Bible. As soon as you dig into interpretation, there's one thing to say like, well, this is what the Bible says. Like I could ask a question like, what does the Bible say about X? And am I just like, here's the verse, here's like 5 different locations in the Bible where it mentions this. Here's the verse, or here's the clause. And that would just be like extracting that. And that's a useful thing. But as soon as the AI assistant starts to interpret that information and say what it means, then you're dabbling in, okay, well, then you have all these different traditions within Protestantism. You have multiple interpretations. The question then becomes is, who's providing that interpretation? Is this AI's own unique analysis, like cobbling together multiple different viewpoints and kind of like melding them together? Usually what I find, especially Claude 3.5, what it does is it does a pretty good job of extracting ideas, interpretations of particular text and saying like, some people say this and others have said this and others have said this, and providing the reference. Augustine said this, but Aquinas was more had these particular thoughts. But nonetheless, like it says here, while interpretations and traditions might vary between denominations, the focus is delivering answers rooted in Scripture. You might say you're answering questions rooted in Scripture, but all of those different traditions, right, and interpretations are, most of those churches would say like, we've rooted our interpretation in Scriptures. If you're defaulting, like Answers in Genesis, it has a very more literal approach to hermeneutics or interpretation of Scripture. And I might say like, well, whatever the Scripture says, and just repeat what Scripture says that's the interpretation, is just what you're hearing, right? God said it, I believe it. But most Christians have a somewhat more nuanced view of Scriptures, the authority of Scripture, how Scripture was written, what God is intending to communicate, and that some interpretive framework needs to be in place. We have to understand the meaning of words, and words have meanings, different meanings potentially at different times. And we're reading it in English versus in Hebrew, right? So there is translation. There's all these different things that can affect really what the intent of the author was. And what we're really interested in is the intent of the author when they wrote those words down. And that's not always blazingly obvious, all right? So you're going to have different interpretations out there. Okay, so anyway, the faith assistant. This is essentially, this thing right here is the same chat box that Answers in Genesis is using. The difference would be is that Answers in Genesis, in fact, the style and everything is the same as Answers in Genesis has, right? So they're providing the programming for this particular chat box on their website, Answers in Genesis. And then they've also provided the post model training on their particular data set. So it will provide answers from Answers in Genesis, not just generic answers from all Protestant traditions, because after all, I mean, Answers in Genesis has a particular view of the doctrine of creation, Adam and Eve and the age of the earth and so forth, which isn't shared by a large number of Protestants. And so therefore they can't rely just on the faith assistant to answer questions. Hey, you know what? I'll just ask this right here. What does the Bible teach about the age of the earth? Though that's a very generic question, trying not to give it any kind of background as to what I'm thinking. See, this is not what Answers in Genesis would like its chatbot to say. The Bible does not explicitly state the age of the earth. However, some people use genealogies and events in the Bible, such as those found in Genesis, to estimate the earth's age. These estimates often suggest a young earth around 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Others interpret the creation account in Genesis more figuratively, allowing for an older earth. Ultimately, the Bible's primary focus is on God's relationship with humanity rather than providing a scientific account of the earth's age. Now, let's keep that in our mind, because let's ask Answers in Genesis the exact same question. Hey, all right. So yeah, we're wearing something different background. I remembered after I got done recording that last video that I forgot to go to Answers in Genesis and ask the question that I said I was going to ask. What does the Bible say about the age of the earth? I wanted to compare, like, what is this generic, Christian chatbot say. We saw, you just listened to that, like what its response was. Now let's go and look at what Answers in Genesis says. So I wrote, what does the Bible say about the age of the earth? And here's Answers in Genesis chatbot response, the AI Genesis response. The Bible provides a framework for understanding the age of the earth through its genealogies and historical accounts, as opposed to the Bible does not explicitly directly address the age of the earth, which is the beginning of the other one. You can examine the genealogies. That estimates that the earth is approximately 6,000 years old. Some more about those calculations. This view contrasts with the mainstream scientific view suggesting the earth is 4.5 billion years old. However, the biblical timeline is consistent with a literal interpretation of the creation account, where God created the world in 6 days. For more information, go see this. All right, so they're not going to present other viewpoints, other Christian viewpoints. Right? It's just like they're going to create the dichotomy of there's secular science and then there's us. There's the view that's the proper view, which is the world is 6,000 years old. So even if their literature somewhere actually does criticize and critique other viewpoints, other Christian viewpoints on the interpretation of Genesis, this chatbot is probably being directed to provide very explicit answers that only represent their view. All right, in order to give direct answers and not sort of provide a like, well, it could be this or it could be that, because in their mind it can't be anything else. It has to be this. All right, so all right, that's the response from Answers in Genesis. Back to your regularly scheduled programming. All right, so it's going to be, we're going to ask the same question, and it's going to be answered by Minstrel as providing the original foundation large language module, like the neural network, right? But it's going to be trained on a different data set. All right, so it has a different background knowledge to provide the answers from. So as I said before, this faith assistant is a very broad-based thing, and we see it right here because this is giving a what I would say is a typical response by most Protestant denominations, but is not the response that Answers in Genesis like to hear. I mean, they're happy that some people interpret it as a young earth, but this is making it pretty clear at the end, this last phrase, ultimately the Bible's primary focus is on God's relationship with humanity rather than providing a scientific account of the Earth's age. That's kind of a classic response by an old Earth creationist as to, we'll just say the Bible does not actually address that directly. So we're free to use the minds God has given us to try to understand the age of the Earth. So in the sidebar over here, you can see I have AI Genesis beta version. They're looking for feedback. Hey, watch my video. Here's some feedback, okay, about your chatbot. Welcome to AI Genesis chat. Ask any question about science, the Bible, and more. We're here to help. They give some suggestions as to what you might be interested in. Interesting that one of the suggestions is the Earth flat? Because that's a thing they've been talking about lately, because they've been trying to squelch the whole flat Earth thing, saying that we don't believe that the Earth is flat, even though it's people who follow Answers in Genesis, well, young Earth creationism in general, that are most prone to end up believing in the flat Earth stuff. Is Homo Naledi? Now, you might think this is kind of an off-the-wall question, and maybe not what you would ask. But what I'm trying to do here is I'm thinking about the literature that I know from Answers in Genesis and specific things I have written about and interacted with in terms of the Answers in Genesis literature. And so I'm really, really well aware of exactly what Answers in Genesis has said on this particular topic. So that allows me to assess the quality of the response from this chatbot. So here we go. I asked, is Homo Naledi a form of human being or another ape? And if the latter, why? It's really a question of, hey, here's a hominid fossil. How can you tell if that thing was a human being, okay, a descendant of Adam and Eve, or was that an ape? And if you ask different young Earth creationist organizations this same question, you get different answers. ICR has a different answer. Creation Ministries International has a little bit different answer. Some young Earth creationists believe that Homo Naledi is absolutely just a different form of human being, right? Like Neanderthals or something like that. They're all just variations of humans, and these are ones that lived in the past and died, and we had their remains. Whereas other Christians, Answers in Genesis, have insisted from the beginning they're just apes. They're not related to human beings. And so let's see what they have to say. Homo Naledi is not considered a form of human being, but rather another type of ape, right? That's exactly what their literature says, as opposed to a lot of other young Earth creationist literature, which does not say that. The evidence suggests that Homo Naledi exhibits many features typical of Australopithecines, or Australopithecine apes rather than humans. For instance, the small brain size, yes, they have very small brains, but so does another fossil called the Hobbit. Get to that. Slope face, curved finger bones are consistent with ape-like characteristics. Additionally, the shoulder joints and flared hips are typical of tree-swinging apes, not humans. These features indicate that Homo Naledi is more likely an example of an ape diversity rather than a human ancestor. And for more detailed information, you can explore the article, Is Homo Naledi a New Species of Human Ancestor? On the Answers in Genesis website. All right, now, they mention several characteristics that make this thing more like an ape than it is like a human, and those are characteristics drawn right out of that particular article. The thing about that particular article is it doesn't really stress or even talk about some of the characteristics that are more like humans than they are like apes, which is the reason why some young creationists think that they were humans. And so this response doesn't mention those characteristics because it doesn't know about those characteristics, because it's really only thinking about the information that's provided from Answers in Genesis. So even though Answers in Genesis is providing you with, hey, here's knowledge about Homo Naledi, but it's very limited knowledge because Answers in Genesis often doesn't present the full story when they write their articles, right? They're very much like focusing you toward one set of data that points to the answer that they're providing. So you have to know going in, if you're asking questions of this chatbot, that you're going to get only information Answers in Genesis has written about and provided. So then I followed up. I said, if Homo Naledi remains were to be associated with tools and production of fire, how would that change how we view the relationship with humans? So there's some recent information that suggests that Homo Naledi, which is fossil remains in a cave in South Africa, might have used fire and might have had tool use, which wasn't in the original discovery. This is one of the reasons I think Answers in Genesis was quick to call it an ape, because it's like, well, we don't see any evidence of culture or anything, in addition to there are some features that are ape-like. This is a very interesting response, because it actually talks kind of the way Answers in Genesis does. Conjecture isn't very helpful, particularly when considering biblical topics. Conjecture isn't very helpful, particularly when considering biblical topics. See, I asked a hypothetical question, right? Well, we don't want to, we're based on, facts here. However, it's important to note that the presence of tools or evidence of fire use with the Homo Naledi remains wouldn't necessarily change their classification as non-human. The ability to use tools or fire doesn't exclusively define humanity. Now, where did they get this from? Is this just the AI? Is this the minstrel neural network that's like thinking about this, going like, oh man, so what would Answers in Genesis think about this? Now, actually, Answers in Genesis has responded to some recent stuff, and they have kind of poo-pooed the idea that, and it even said, well, even if there were tools, that doesn't necessarily make them human. All right, and they've had some excuses for that, which are exactly the ones down here. Many animals, including some birds and primates, use tools. They are not considered human. Now, what if Answers in Genesis had never responded to this question? What would the chatbot do? I'm really not sure. We'll explore that in just a moment. Maybe I'll try something out. From a biblical perspective, humans are uniquely created in the image of God, which is not determined by tool use or other physical attributes, but by spiritual or relationship capacities. Therefore, even if Homo Naledi were found with tools or evidence of fire, it would not necessarily imply that they were human. You can read this particular one, which is the same article, okay, as it was before. I said, interesting. If this is the case, then wouldn't it be the case that similarities with Australopithecines are just conjecture as well? I mean, after all, we don't know how much variation might be possible among the descendants of Adam. I mean, how do you know? Were you there? I mean, Adam, you're saying that they're like Neanderthals. Answers in Genesis, Neanderthals are just human beings. And so the variations that they have, which they do have variations that are sort of outside the variation range that modern humans have today, they would have to say that, well, those are just broader variations of humans that were possible from Adam and Eve's descendants. They're going to put Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and several other different named species of ancient humans. They're going to call just descendants of Adam and Eve, and they're just going to say, well, that's all the variation within humans. And so I was simply like trying to stimulate it and say like, you just said that it had these characteristics that were kind of ape-like. I happen to know there's a bunch of characteristics that are human-like as well in Homo Naledi. How do you know that you're not just conjecturing? You don't know how much variation there could have been in Adam and Eve that could have given them characteristics that are kind of like apes. After all, obviously, we have a bunch of characteristics that are in common with chimpanzees. I mean, so there are features we do have that are similar. And so just because these organisms, these individuals had characteristics that were similar to apes, does that necessarily make them an ape? I'm kind of trying to push it here. So now, how did it respond to that? While it's true there can be variation among human descendants, the similarities between Homo Naledi and Australopithecines, I always have trouble saying that, are based on specific anatomical features that align more closely with apes than with humans. Again, there are a couple specific characteristics of the anatomy of Homo Naledi that are much more similar to modern humans than they are to apes, chimpanzees in particular. In which case, if you were just looking at those characteristics, you would say, absolutely, they must be human. They've just chosen a selection of characteristics that they say like define apes versus humans. These include brain size, curved fingers, flared hips, all the same ones I mentioned before. The Bible provides a clear distinction between humans and animals, with humans being created with spiritual and rational capacities. Therefore, while there is variation within the humankind, the distinct ape-like features of Homo naledi suggest it is not a descendant of Adam, but rather part of a diversity within the ape kind. For more information, read this article, which is the same article again. All right. Hey, all the answers are in that particular article. Okay, I said. It appears to me that the features of Homo, basically I'm saying, okay, all right, done with that. But one more little thing here. If it appears to me that the features of Homo floresiensis, which is called the hobbit from Indonesia, are as different from humans as are those of Homo naledi. I mean, this is a 4 foot tall, tiny brained hominoid from Indonesia, which has a bunch of really distinctive features that no other like modern human has. Do you also think that these diminutive fossils from Flores Island were also just a form of ape, or might you consider them human beings, and why? Homo floresiensis, often referred to as the hobbits, are considered to be fully human. See, it's gotten that from the website, right? It's knowledge, which is Answers in Genesis. This is what Answers in Genesis says. From the very beginning of the discovery of the Hobbit, they have said this is a modern human. This is the descendant of Adam and Eve, and therefore are human beings. Now, here's the interesting thing about them, right? They did have distinctive features, right? They had characteristics that were very human-like, but they had characteristics that are also ape-like. They've chosen to, in this case, to hone in on the human-like features and assign it to a human. But there's another really important thing that was found with Homo floresiensis, the hobbit. Lots of tools. Right? Evidence that they're catching animals and they have a fire and they're cooking them there and stuff like that. I think that combined with, allowed them to say, oh, well, this seems like more like human activity. Oh, then there's some bones that there are some anatomical features that make them like a human. So therefore, they're obviously just humans. Because remember, they have to put in one category or the other. There's no transition between the two, between humans and non-humans. So, and Ken Ham always says, it's always clear. It's very clear which is which. It's easy to tell. In this case, Homo naledi, that's not an ape. I mean, that's an ape. Homo floresiensis? No, it's clearly a human. If I just brought you some of the bones and laid them out in front of you and laid out a modern human and asked you to pick which one is which, depending on which bone you picked up, you'd struggle to tell the difference, I think. Despite their small statures and unique features, the evidence suggests these individuals were likely true humans. But they might have had some other condition. Now, this is what they have suggested. Maybe they had microcephaly, or maybe they had malnutrition, or something else was going on that made them extra short in stature. Unlike Homo naledi, which exhibits more ape-like characteristics, and then it goes on to say the same stuff, right? Hey, it's got ape-like characteristics because those are the only ones we reported in our literature. So, right, for the chatbot, it's very clear. There's a clear difference between these two. For more information, go to this particular article on Homo floresiensis, which is the article that, mentions all those things. So I say, I move on, and I just have a couple more things here. Thanks. I also was interested in your understanding of the relationship of chimpanzees with other great apes. Do you believe that they are all descendants of a pair of apes on the ark, or are chimpanzees a separately created kind from other great apes? I have seen a display on the Ark encounter that shows all great apes as sharing a single common ancestor on the Ark, well, excluding humans, of course. Right? So this is something that I hear people who are big followers of Ken Ham and so forth, they'll say like, oh, Ken Ham doesn't say that. I mean, Answers in Genesis doesn't believe that chimpanzees and orangutans and gorillas are all the same kind. But in fact, they do have a display that suggests that they are all the same kind, called what they call the great ape kind. Therefore, they all have a common ancestor. So let's see what the chatbot picked up on, or I should say AI Genesis picked up on. Chimpanzees, along with the other great apes, are believed to be descendants of a single pair of apes that were on Noah's Ark. According to the biblical account, God created animals according to their kinds, and after the flood, they diversified into various species we see today. That's a huge amount of diversification. I've talked about this many times, but if you haven't heard that, just let that sink in. Chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, and gorillas are all share a common ancestor. They evolved from two animals just 4,500 years ago into all those different shapes and sizes that you see today. This means that gorillas, chimpanzees, orangutans, and other great apes share a common ancestor from the ark. They are distinct from humans who are uniquely created in the image of God. Right? That's what separates them. Really not really their biology. Right? Because if you just consider the skeletons or the anatomy or even the physiology, there's more diversity between these other apes than there are as humans between humans and chimpanzees. So that's why they're stressing like it's the image of God that is the thing that's different with human beings. The Ark encounter provides a visual representation of this understanding, showing how different ape species could have diversified from the original kind and were preserved on the Ark. This view aligns with the biblical account of creation and the flood. There's nowhere in the Bible where it says that all the apes are one kind, emphasizing that human and apes do not share a common ancestor. For more insights into the diversity of classification of apes and their humans, you can explore the article Given and Opportunity. All right, then I asked one last thing, because this is very controversial among young Earth creationists. The position of the flood, post-flood boundary. Where in the geological column did the flood end and then things that happen after the flood are recorded? I just tell it, hey, this is controversial among creationists. What is your current understanding of where that boundary lies, and what evidence would you bring to support that? The flood, post-flood boundary is indeed a topic of discussion among creationists, with various views on its precise location in the geological column. Okay. A common position is the boundary lies near the end of the Cretaceous or the beginning of the Tertiary period. This is the position of Answers in Genesis generally. All right. This is based on the observation that the character of sedimentation changes from global or continental in the Mesozoic to more local or regional, in the Tertiary, suggesting a shift from flood to post-flood processes. Evidence supporting this boundary placement includes the nature of the sedimentary deposits they just mentioned, fossil distribution. Yes, that there's a break, right? We've got like a huge extinction event, and then there's like diversification after that point. Like all the great apes, right? They're only found, in this upper layers. The presence of widespread sedimentary layers, rapid burial, blah, blah, blah. All right. For more detailed exploration of this topic, you can read the article Evidence for Late Cenozoic Flood, Post-Flood Boundary on the Answers in Genesis website. That is like the go-to article for their explanation for where the flood, post-flood boundary is. They didn't really give any credit to any other model, like the ICR model for the post-flood boundary, which is much farther up the fossil record than this one. They simply presented the evidence for their particular view because it's trained on the evidence from Answers in Genesis. Now, what's kind of interesting here is there was a series of articles in their research journal, which were like a back and forth between their view and other views. And so you would think having all that information it's being trained on, that it would try to present both of those views, because maybe like it wouldn't know exactly what the position of Answers in Genesis is. That's where the idea of post-training these models comes in. There are ways of saying, like, for particular things, this is our viewpoint, right? So you're focused on that. And so you can train the model to give the types of answers you would like to give it. that takes a lot of actual human work to do. The other option is to simply not give it the material from the other side. Right? If they published multiple articles that had different viewpoints, they could just give it the article that only has one viewpoint, the one that they want to push, and therefore don't even give the AI model, don't even train it on the opposing viewpoint. You know what? Let me ask one other question that's about me. All right, it's about me because they've written about me. So let's say, what is your opinion about critics of young Earth creationism and Joel Duff in particular? Let's find out here. I didn't do this before. I really don't know what it's going to say. Critics of young Earth creationism, such as those by Joel Duff, often stem from a misunderstanding or misrepresentation of the creationist perspective. Joel Duff, a member of the Biologos community, has been known to misrepresent the beliefs of creationists. Yeah, there's a whole article about me being misrepresenting their view. For instance, he has suggested that by acknowledging the speciation through God-ordained natural mechanisms, young Earth creationists are inadvertently moving closer to accepting evolutionary mechanisms. I've written a whole article on that, and Nathaniel Jeanson wrote a whole article about how I was, misrepresenting their view. This mischaracterizes the creationist view, which distinguishes between limited speciation with created kinds and the broader claims of molecules to man evolution. Of course, I know that about creationism, and I said that about creationism. They just have a very different definition of evolution when they discuss this. Answers in Genesis emphasizes that accepting natural selection, mutations, and genetic drift does not equate to accepting evolutionary theory as a whole. I agree, but they are accepting that those mechanisms can create species and are the thing that is generating the diversity of species on the earth. These mechanisms are seen as insufficient to account for the complexity and diversity of life as proposed by evolutionary theory. Instead, creationists maintain that the Bible provides a clear and accurate account of origins of life, with humans uniquely created in the image of God. And again, I understand all those things about Answers in Genesis and what their viewpoint is. I'm simply stressing in that particular article that they are suggesting that we just talked about it. They're suggesting that two primates, two great apes, were on the ark. And when they got off the ark, they became bonobos, chimpanzees, orangutans, gorillas. There's actually multiple different species of gorillas. There's multiple different other extinct versions of other great apes. So we're talking 40 or 50 different species of great apes. And those great apes have more genetic diversity between them than a human being has between a chimpanzee and a human being. That's an enormous amount of change. Different environments, different behaviors. That is going back up here. That is arguing that there is a sufficient, they can sufficiently account for the complexity and diversity of life, right? Because that's incredibly diverse, more diverse than the original two animals could have contained in them. All right. And so they are employing a form of evolution in terms of diversification and adaptation, which includes the origin of unique characteristics in order to accommodate new environments. Right. That is the core of On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection, plus additional mechanisms that Darwin wasn't necessarily aware of at the time. For more insights into the critiques of young Earth creationism and the responses from Answers in Genesis, you should explore the article Biologos Criticism, Atheist Welcome on the Answers in Genesis website. All right, one last one, because I want to know, can it say something that it doesn't know from the Answers in Genesis website? So I'm going to ask, what is your position on the angelic fall hypothesis. Actually, maybe they have written about this. We'll find out. Fallen angels. Scripture does not mention any technological or genetic capabilities attributed to angels. Therefore, the hypothesis is not consistent with biblical understanding of the creation and role of angels. I'm not sure that answers in Genesis. I'll have to look whether they've actually written about this particular hypothesis and this is their response, whether this is a case where it's just using minstrels, overall neural network in order to answer this question from the totality of its training. Because I'm not sure where it would have gotten this from otherwise. Especially since it says, for more information, you can explore the article, Did Dinosaurs Actually Exist? On the Answers in Genesis website. I'm not sure, did dinosaurs exist? Is that really going to have this information about, the idea that angels were able to hybridize with animals? Yeah, you know what? Let's click on it and find out. We occasionally hear from people that claim that dinosaurs never existed, and this article will examine many of the various reasons they give. Theological issues. All died except for the flood. Oh, here we go. Although none of the extra biblical books mention dinosaurs, fallen angels corrupting creation in some manner in Jubilees, which is not in the regular canon of the Bible. As a result of union with women and animals, we have stated before, we do not take a particular position on the identity of the sons of God or the mention of the Nephilim. As it never states that fallen angels mated with animals or created. See, actually, the angelic fall hypothesis is much more than just this idea of the Nephilim and that they, bestiality relationships with humans or something like that. And so, yes, I think that it did get its response from this section here, because this is the only place on the Answers in Genesis website it probably mentions angelic fall or angels. And so then it's just putting it in the context of the Nephilim. All right, but the angelic fall hypothesis is something that's much, includes a lot of other things besides this. Yeah, I'm just gonna check myself here. Let's see what Claude says about angel. Describe the angelic fall hypothesis. Yeah, okay, all right. I was right. I started to doubt myself when I started to read that description by Answers in Genesis. The angelic fall hypothesis is a theological concept proposing that some angels, led by Satan, Lucifer, rebelled against God and were cast out of heaven. According to this hypothesis, these angels were originally created good, chose to rebel against the divine authority. Typical narrative suggests that pride and desire to usurp God's position led to this rebellion. Hypothesis appears in various forms from different theological traditions. Early Christian writers like Augustine of Hippo, Origen, so forth. All right, right. See, there's nothing in here about Nephilim and all that. So, I got myself off. I got myself doubting myself about the angelic fall hypothesis, even though I was just talking about it with somebody else the other day. So what you have is Answers in Genesis response. It really does look like it is only trained from Answers in Genesis material. It couldn't respond to the general angelic fall hypothesis and tell you what it is. It simply found something in its own literature that mentioned angels, fallen angels, and that context was fallen angels that were having sex basically with humans, right, to create the Nephilim. Right, that's a separate thing, but that's all it had to go on. So it's going to try to provide an answer to whatever you ask it, and so it basically assigned the angelic fall hypothesis to that particular concept. So this does tell me, this brief exercise here does strongly suggest that that they really have put the clamps on, don't answer questions outside of our material. We've trained this thing to provide answers that it will only find the answers from our literature. Well, it's a brave new world we live in, with all these different ways of accessing information and having these neural networks interpret or report, synthesize, the thoughts of many authors and collectively pull that together to provide an answer. And, honestly, for this is kind of useful for me because it is a way of saying, like, yeah, here's what Answers in Genesis says. All right, I think I'll quit there. I just wanted to show you the latest and greatest from Answers in Genesis. And I will be, I'm sure I'll be utilizing that resource myself. All right, with that, I'll say we'll see you when we see you. Bye-bye.